Hello everyone, this is Outside the Wall, and today I'm here with Wally and Evildex,
Hello.
Hello.
and we'll be talking about Fantastic Planet by René Laloux. It is our second film in our French animated film fortnight, which coincidentally ended up being 70s animation, and we're going to start then with Evildex's opinion about it.
Okay. So last week when we discussed Asterix, I talked about how it was a deviation from my expectations of French animation, which was very strange sort of subject matter. But we certainly have gotten back to that with this one. Um, the basic summary of this is that in some kind of distant planet, humans have been taken as a kind of pet animal by these giant aliens, and it begins with a wild human being killed by like boys playing with it, as they will do on this planet with some small animals, and its child, or her child rather, being taken in as a pet for a long time, which kind of looks like an extended sequence based on somebody's fetishes, where he's being dressed up in strange outfits and like dominated by this giant blue alien woman. And then he escapes and they form sort of human revolution designed to kind of create their own independent society. Um, at first, that premise makes it seem like quite a nihilistic film, really, where the characters are being just subject to the random whims of other characters as well as sort of just existence in general, and people will, die very randomly to kind of shows the brutality of existence. But um, I was surprised as it went on that it sort of seemed to take a more positive view of humanity than that, which is showcased in the fact that the human characters in this are able to essentially overcome their problems and end up successfully rebelling from this alien society. So that was a bit interesting to me. I find that the like really over the top nihilism can become a bit I guess you could say draining over time, just because there's not enough of a sense of relief for it. I think this movie does ultimately avoid that pitfall. The animation style is somewhat notable. It uses a more detailed, lifelike style, I guess you could say, but that does come at the expense of the overall amount of movement in each shot, as I said in the previous podcast. So it's a mixed bag in that regard, I would say, but it's definitely a unique style. Overall, I liked it. I wasn't like, completely thrilled with it. I'd say like some of the characterization stuff isn't super strong in this. That's kind of what prevents it from being, a greater film. And that's where I'll leave it, I guess.
Yeah, so this was, of the two animated movies we had seen, I prefer this over Asterix, but that necessarily isn't saying much. So, one of the first things I noticed about this animation style, and I commented very early in our discussion on it, is that I can see this either, if not this film directly influencing, but this animation style influencing Terry Gilliam of Monty Python fame. So a lot of the animated skits that you would see in the Monty Python show, Terry Gilliam was the animator on, and it's very much is the same style animation that I picked up on very quickly. So as Exta said, it's very artistic in its drawings and designs, but it lacks any kind of fluid animation that maybe is people are more familiar with in other forms. So this is very much an allegorical tale that essentially is commenting on things like racism, colonialism, and human rights in general. I think for me, as someone who's kind of gotten bitten by the Tolkien bug, I somewhat find allegories a bit boring in a way. So while I did enjoy the film, it wasn't something that I think would stand out for me as exemplary or outstanding as far as its story goes and its uniqueness. Um, because I think there are better ways to tell a story of that caliber without having to necessarily be that fantastical about it. But overall, I think as an animation form, I think it's an enjoyable to watch, even though there are some weird fetishes I think that happen during this film. And I think I'll probably leave it at that for now.
Okay, so I quite enjoy Fantastic Planet. The more it progressed, as we would like also mention, I thought at the start it was going to be a very pessimistic take. Like it seemed that humans really didn't even have any kind of chance of getting out of the situation, since the the alien race that's the drags, they're giants, and they have a very developed system of technology, and even have like this astral projection kind of ability. It seems that they really didn't even have anything at all. But as it did progress, and with our character, he he starts Ter starts developing more and more knowledge, and he takes more autonomy in escaping and joining the new band of humans, and it started enjoying it more. One of the things that I like a lot about this film was the soundtrack. It's pretty much a staple of psychedelic rock, and I thought it was really really nice, and I enjoy several tracks used alongside it. It does. I remember that Wally said when we were watching the film that it very much has the sense, the movie itself, of Dr. Seuss on LSD. I found
Yes.
that really amusing, and it can I can see why, definitely, and I will agree with it. Yeah, it is. One thing that I think we ended up agreeing on is that at the end the movie does film like, instead of being the Fantastic Planet, it is the Kinky Planet, and I think we can discuss that a bit more towards the as we podcast goes on. I do agree that the characterization could be improved. It does feel like it goes on quite a fast pace. Uh, it is, after all, a very short movie. It's only like 70 minutes long, but um, there's still, it's mostly just like a more broader view on the humans that were in the planet, rather than trying to, even though Terror is the one that gets the most focus, let's say, there's still quite a bit that could have been done with him, I feel. And but I still did enjoy how the story itself was presented and the progression that it had. And perhaps just the ending could have been expanded a bit more, since it does get quite a quick resolution, but given the circumstances, it might be a bit understandable. And I did enjoy this. This is also my second René Laloux film that I've seen. The other one was Gandahar, which he worked on, I think, like 14 years later, if I remember correctly. It's 1987 film. This one is a 1973 one. So the animation is no longer this kind of artistic style where it's a bit more a mix of realistic and fantastical, but the cause of the movement. The other one is certainly more fluid and a bit more cartoonish, we can say, to a certain point. It's still very. You can still detect the Renault artistic take on it, and that's very cool. I would say that perhaps this may be the better film, but at least when it came to some of the characters, perhaps Kandahar is a bit more, let's say, friendlier to for audiences. Since I have a feeling a lot of people will be jarring at seeing this kind of animation continuously for an hour, which is I know that this has been a comment of some people sometimes when I've seen Monty Python with me, when they see the Terry Gilliam skits as Wally mentioned, they seem a bit jarred by it. So I think that something like Fantastic Planet might actually really put them away, sadly. But yeah, no, I did enjoy this. So.
So I should maybe note too, with the Dr. Seuss comment, that it probably is fair enough to say that Dr. Seuss in general could have been done on LSD. This, I think, the Fantastic Planet seems to dispense though with the kid themes and the more, it has a more definitely more mature setting and kinky setting too, which we can comment on.
Yeah, Evil Dex had mentioned that part was really like Ter being a submissive part of a relationship. It's being dressed and
Mhm.
very
Like
much abuse.
that's most eloquent at like the start when he's like naked except for a dog collar. That's very much a fixture of like bondage and dominance stuff.
Yes, it harkens back to the sort of slave market that existed in history.
Yes, that as well.
But I'm wondering too, is regarding the kinkiness of it, if maybe that was just the easiest way for the director to make it a adult film, as opposed to the assumption that I think animated films or animated shows in general tend to have, is that they're more for kids or less mature audiences.
Um,
I'm also speculating on what the French society was like in the 70s, if they were a little more liberal in their um, art styles and depiction of things like nudity, all because I know in the United
Um,
States that definitely wasn't the case.
I think they are. Yeah, I think most countries are in comparison to the U.S. I've read people noting that Europeans in general tend to be more lax about nudity than the U.S.
Indeed, I wouldn't say that it was just a way of like their edgy way, let's say, to make it an adult theme. I think it was more of a cultural thing instead.
Yeah, I wanted to make that joke that the kinkiness is just what you'd expect from the French.
True, it's the same country that has nude beaches, so
Well, this country has, Canada has nude beaches too, but probably not as many as the French.
be a little frigid, I would imagine.
Okay, then, well, back to Fantastic Planet. Then, uh, I would say that I don't think it was Renella Luke's way of doing so. At least compared with Gandahar, Gandahar does have some kinkiness to it, but it is a lot more contained. I think it's very much just one scene with one sequence where it is like really showcased. While in compared with Fantastic Planet or the Wild Planet, then it is a bit more noticeable. It was certainly noticeable throughout the film, even all the way to the end when
Well,
the revelation of what the second planet is. It was truly the kinky planet.
yeah, maybe that's just an effect of Renee aging between the two films, though, because I imagine most artists are a little less want to use that kind of stuff 14 years later.
Um, well, back to the point that you had mentioned, Nippletex, that it does have a more hopeful take of humanity being able to overcome their bigger problems. And one of the things that happened within the film was that despite the savage humans, let's say, to to label the group, uh, despite them being against the drags and trying to survive, the human groups that within themselves still fought against each other, which is a common theme I see in this kind of film. They were, despite humanity being on the verge of extinction, let's say, or suffering, within themselves there's still a major type of strife. The, however, I think this is broken towards the end when Ter goes out of his way to warn the second group about the mass dehumanization. I think it was, I forgot.
They
Sorry.
call it de-ominizing or de-oming, which is basically the exact same thing because om, which is the supposed alien word for humans, is just pronounced exactly the same way as as in men in French.
I mean, it's essentially genocide, is what we're talking about.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, but it's also compared to like dealing with pests, like
Right.
how you'd use the raid to get rid of ants in your house.
Indeed. And Terra basically ends up like breaking that cycle of uh, human internal struggles by the ones that he managed to save end up uniting with them later to create the technology that would allow them to, in the end, save all of them.
Yeah, so just to clarify, Raim is trying to talk about this point that's quite common in fiction where even when people are faced with some kind of terrible difficulty to overcome, like an apocalypse, for example. They'll still have a lot of conflicts between one another. Another funny story that you can see this in actually is Sword Art Online, which is about a bunch. It's in a crappy anime about a bunch of kids being stuck in a video game together, and even though the problems of the video game are supposed to be what's killing everybody, the main character spends most of his time dealing with other people who are assholes. But I think in that case, it's just because the writer didn't really think things through very well. That theme emerges.
It definitely speaks to what you were saying earlier about having a more positive outlook at the end of the film, because not only does Renee bridge the gap between the warring factions of the humans or the Alms, he also bridges the gap between the Alms and the
Drax.
Drax at the end, which, from my experience watching some more American type of films, I think it would have been a very different ending had it been an American director or American studio. It very much would have been a kind of Independence Day type of ending, where they kick the ass of the oppressors and basically wipe them out and turn the tables.
Yeah, that is actually what I was expecting to happen as it developed. So I was surprised that they ended up going for peace in that way. May definitely speak to the difference between American and French sensibilities on the matter.
It wasn't imperialist enough, you mean?
Well, or anti-imperialist enough, because another film we could compare this to is Avatar, where it's done in reverse, where the aliens are like compared to natives, say, and the humans are the invaders, and that does very much end with the like alien group assisted by the one main character kicking out the human colonizers. So there's no peaceful reconciliation between the two groups in that example.
Indeed. Well, at least in the major groups, yeah. That's only like a handful of characters that do end up mixing with the Navi. I actually, when I watched Kandahar, I had a feeling that James Cameron probably saw it or something, because the blue people and the style that they go around with nature is very well. The the plot of Kandahar is that there's this group of people that have been denying, let's say, technology itself. All of their culture is based around natural and organic technology, let's say, and development. And they're being invaded by this group of robots that turns them into stone. So they're pretty much they're a pacifist group that has never faced any kind of danger in this way and isn't prepared to face it, or they're facing very much extinction. So it actually reminded me a bit of Avatar in that sense. So I feel that between Kandahar and Avatar, I will pick Kandahar any day.
Well, that kind of goes back to something we were talking about on our server related to Avatar, which is that it's just not a very original movie in general, and you can compare it quite heavily to a lot of other films, including Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, and Fern Gully, for example.
Yes, well, Dances with Wolves, I think, is the one that at least as people claim, is directly taking from that story.
Yeah, and then maybe we could group this film Fantastic Planet in with all of those as well, to a certain extent, although not as obviously as something like Avatar.
Well, it also segues into a point that I want to maybe discuss a bit in the use of allegory itself. And as I had stated in my kind of summarization of this, is that I'm not a huge fan of allegory, mainly because I find that if you're going to talk about a sensitive subject, it sometimes is maybe better to just talk about that subject instead of creating a fantastical world around it. And so, like, a good comparison would be Avatar versus Dances with Wolves. Avatar is a very fictionalized fantasy setting, and the allegory is that the blue aliens are the Native Americans in this case, whereas Dances with Wolves is entirely based on America's expansion out west and kind of removing the natives from their homes. And I think of the two, probably Dances with Wolves is the better story, just because it brings to the forefront that reality that actually existed, whereas Avatar makes it seem so fantastical that average audience member that would watch this might not make that connection. Or if they do, it because it's so fantasized that they don't necessarily do anything about it. It's just a movie that they enjoyed watching.
Yeah, so I do think that a weakness of this allegorical approach is that it often means that the discussion of whatever theme they're talking about will lack specificity, which can be a big problem because it can sort of undermine the entire message, or at least make it very difficult to parse what exactly the message is, per se. I think a movie that we can actually use as an example of this to a certain extent is Disney's Zootopia, which is like um, it uses the allegory of animals, like furries, for racism or bigotry, anyways, in general. But it's difficult to tell which, if any, specific type of bigotry it's referring to. So,
Right.
for example, I've seen both feminists and men's rights activists try to claim Zootopia as their guy.
That could also shed light on those particular ideologies as well, and kind of people seeing what they want to see in those movies as well, which I think speaks to your point about allegories being kind of vague in its what it's trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. It does expose that a little bit. Well, in the case of Zootopia specifically, I think the reason men's rights activists can kind of claim it is because there's this line of dialogue where it says the predators, which are now like the second class citizens, used to rule the world essentially, which could be related to the status of men and couldn't as directly be related to the status of like blacks in the USA, for example, which I've seen the film interpreted as an allegory for as well.
Yes, I think part of the problem with that film too is because it's a Disney film, it's definitely going to very heavily gloss over some more serious themes,
Yeah,
which is it's been guilty of numerous times in other films as well.
I think perhaps one of the reasons why this is also done is obviously to reach a larger audience, in the sense that if we just took, let's say, the Dances with Wolves example, perhaps some people might not really empathize as much with the oppressed group, let's say, for one reason or another. While with
Well,
Fantastic Planet or anything, it is a bit more clear that it's just humanity itself.
well, it's also because it might press up against certain political pressures. So, I mean, obviously, with something like Dances with Wolves, you might have someone of a more conservative bent think it's an overreaction, or it's the sort of what, at least in America, conservatives kind of mockingly call the bleeding heart of certain people. I think might also be part of the reason why some might find allegory more uh, usable. In the same way that, for example, science fiction is used often by a lot of writers and creators as a way of criticizing or looking at our society by putting it way so far in the future that it's hard to really say what or what individuals or what specific societies they are critiquing.
yeah. So another thing we can talk about with respect to allegory is that it's also sometimes used to avoid the censorious nature of particularly draconian governments. I think an example of that in film that we have, Rain watched this one recently, is it the spirit of the beehive?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. When you
Yeah.
mentioned that it's the spirit of the beehive, does the allegories are super strong actually. So quite a few of them for my head. I am just a bit familiar with Spanish history, so basically with Franco's dictatorship, they couldn't really do a lot of it. So there's this underlying theme of the basically the ones that sympathizers of the dictatorship, they and the ones that are not, and the entire film itself ends up being like an allegory for it. I think it is quite a good film, actually worth watching, and it does a lot of it does. Upon further reading, was work upon it to pretty much criticize that dictatorship in a way that would fly over a lot of people's heads. But
Right.
so
And I think
it is important to take the context in that case then of when it was released and why it was released too.
right. I think the most maybe the most popular example of this too would be George Orwell's Animal Farm, which ironically was also originally refused publication in America because, according to the publisher at the time, they told Orwell that they didn't think a story about animals would sell well to kids. This is the same country that has Disney and Mickey Mouse as its main proponent.
Yeah, that's funny. That reminds me a little bit of the ironic point that the Former People podcast made about how Nabokov and who was the other one?
Solzhenitsyn
Yeah, were both censored
in their
in
opposing countries. Yeah.
Yeah, or they wouldn't have been censored if they were in the opposite countries, which was
Right.
quite funny. Yeah, so America's reasons for refusing publication will often be very different to what something like the USSR or Franco's Spain would do. It might even just be for money in the case of America.
Have you read any literature that criticizes the USSR in an allegorical way, Alex?
No, most of the Russian. I haven't read very much like Russian literature to be clear, and all of it predates the Soviet Union.
I was just curious if there was something out there since.
Well, there probably is.
But it's not as noticeable, perhaps.
There is. I mean, you have obviously Solzhenitsyn, who's critical of it. Victor Sergei has also written several novels critical of the Soviet regime, and another author who's escaping me right now that I know for those who follow the interwebs, Slavoj Žižek has recommended over Solzhenitsyn, and might be able to drudge up who that is really quickly.
Yeah, I'll just fill a bit with Solzhenitsyn then, because I happen to know a little bit about him from my favorite patriotic Professor Jordan Peterson, which is that Gulag Archipelago was in fact written while Solzhenitsyn was serving his time in a Soviet Gulag. For as many artists did, coming up against whatever random point of contention Stalin happened to find with him. I know that filmmakers have done this sometimes for very arbitrary reasons. There's one whose name I can't remember now who was doing a sort of multi-part biopic on Ivan the Terrible, who Stalin just liked. It was one of his favorite historical figures, and it eventually ended up getting censored for being too critical of Ivan the Terrible. And likewise, I know our beloved Tarkovsky wound up opposed a little bit to the Soviet regime and had to sort of flee to Italy, and later Sweden, I think, for his final two films.
Yeah, Italy for nostalgia.
Varlam Shalamov is the author I was thinking of, who wrote Sketches of the Criminal World, which is a collection of short stories that are basically written from the Gulag. And as I said, Zizek recommends that over Solzhenitsyn, so I don't know if that...
Yeah, I must have actually read either of those.
Agitates, I was going to say, if that claim agitates anyone here, but I doubt it.
No. The Gulag Archipelago is on my to-read list. I'll get around to it one day, I hope.
So do I. It's on my shelf.
Well, I don't know if you have anything else to say then about Fantastic Planet.
Nothing comes to mind.
Nothing.
Yeah, I think so too. So, summing up, this is Renella Lu's first animation film, and I would recommend it. I think that at least all of us enjoyed it and consider it the better film out of the two animated films that we watched, the French animated films that we watched in this fortnight. It is quite a psychedelic trip, talking about human rights and slavery, colonialism, as mentioned. It could perhaps polish a bit on how it was presented, its characters and its plot. However, I think it is still a very enjoyable animation trip and quite good to look back on, considering it's almost 50 years old now. So only 47 years old, if I'm correct. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you for listening to us, and see you next time.